Before we dive into this incredible story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about HOA power trips, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to follow along for this wild ride. Picture this: I'm standing on my own dock, watching my friends enjoy a peaceful afternoon by the lake, when suddenly this woman marches up to me like she owns the place. Her face is red with anger, and she's waving some official-looking papers in the air. "You need to get these people off this lake right now," she screams. "I'm the HOA president, and this is a violation of our community rules." I look at her calmly and say the 5 words that made her face go completely white: "It's my private land, ma'am." The woman just stood there, frozen like a statue, her mouth hanging open. The papers in her hand started shaking, and I could see the exact moment when she realized she had made the biggest mistake of her HOA career. But what happened next? Well, that's where our story really begins. Let me take you back to how this whole mess started, because what led up to this moment will shock you even more than what I just told you. My name is Jake, and I'm a 34-year-old software engineer who always dreamed of owning a house by the water. After years of saving every penny and working countless overtime hours, I finally had enough money to buy my dream home. When I first saw the listing for this beautiful house on Lake Harmony, I knew it was perfect. The house sat on 2 acres of land with 200 feet of private lakefront. Yes, you heard that right, private lakefront. This wasn't community property or shared space. It was mine, all mine, according to the deed and every legal document I had. The house itself was like something out of a magazine. It had large windows that looked out over the crystal clear water, a wraparound porch perfect for morning coffee, and best of all, a private dock where I could keep a boat and have friends over for swimming and fishing. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, had lived there for over 40 years and had built the dock himself back in the 1980s. When I bought the house, Mr. Henderson made sure to explain everything to me very clearly. "Son," he said in his gentle voice, "this land goes all the way to the water's edge and about 100 feet into the lake itself. I have all the original surveys and documents. The HOA was formed around this property, but this land was never part of it. Don't let anyone tell you different." I thought that was kind of odd. Why would he warn me about that? But I just smiled and thanked him, thinking it probably wouldn't be an issue. Oh, how wrong I was. The neighborhood around the lake was really nice. Most of the houses were part of something called Harmony Heights HOA, which had been created about 15 years ago when a developer built a bunch of houses around the lake. The HOA had its own small beach area and a community dock on the other side of the lake. The houses in the HOA were beautiful too, but they were closer together and didn't have the private lakefront that my property had. For the first few months after moving in, everything was perfect. I would wake up each morning, make my coffee, and sit on my dock watching the sunrise over the water. Sometimes I'd see ducks swimming by or catch a glimpse of a deer coming down to drink from the lake. It was like living in paradise. On weekends, I'd invite friends over for barbecues and swimming parties. My buddy Mike would bring his kids, and we'd spend hours teaching them how to fish off my dock. My friend Sarah loved to bring her paddleboard and glide across the calm water in the early morning. Everyone always commented on how lucky I was to have such an amazing place. The neighbors seemed friendly enough. They would wave when they saw me working in my yard or taking my boat out for a spin. A few of them even stopped by to introduce themselves and welcome me to the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought me homemade cookies and told me all about the local grocery stores and restaurants. Tom and Linda from across the street invited me to their 4th of July party and seemed like really nice people. But there was one person who always seemed a little different. Her name was Karen Mitchell, and she lived in one of the HOA houses about 3 streets over from the lake. Karen was a tall, thin woman with short blonde hair who always seemed to be walking around the neighborhood with a clipboard and a serious expression on her face. Other neighbors had mentioned that she was the HOA president and took her job very seriously, maybe a little too seriously. I first met Karen about 2 months after I moved in. I was unloading groceries from my car when she walked up my driveway with that clipboard of hers. She had a fake smile plastered on her face, but her eyes were cold and calculating. "Hi there," she said in a voice that was trying way too hard to sound friendly. "I'm Karen Mitchell, the president of Harmony Heights HOA. I wanted to stop by and welcome you to our community. Thanks, that's very kind, I replied, setting down my grocery bags. I'm Jake. Nice to meet you. Oh, it's wonderful to meet you too. She glanced toward my house and dock, and I noticed her eyes lingering on my private beach area. What a lovely property you have here. I don't think I've seen your HOA dues payments come through yet. Did you need help with the paperwork? This was the moment I should have seen the warning signs. But I was still in my friendly, new neighbor mode, so I just smiled and explained politely. Oh, actually, my property isn't part of the HOA, I said. This land was here before the HOA was formed. I have all the original deeds and surveys if you need to see them. Karen's fake smile flickered for just a second, like a light bulb having a power surge. But then it snapped right back into place. Oh my, she laughed, but it didn't sound genuine at all. I think there might be some confusion. All the properties around Lake Harmony are part of our HOA. It was established to protect property values and maintain our beautiful community standards. I understand that, I said, still trying to be polite. But my property predates the HOA and was specifically excluded from it. The previous owner made sure to explain all of this to me. Karen's clipboard shifted in her hands, and I could see her knuckles turning white from gripping it so tight. Well, she said, her voice getting a little sharper, I'll need to look into this. Sometimes there are misunderstandings about property boundaries and HOA membership. The way she said misunderstandings made it sound like she thought I was either lying or stupid. But I just nodded and said I'd be happy to show her the documentation anytime she wanted to see it. After that first meeting, I started noticing Karen around my property a lot more often. She would walk by on her neighborhood inspections, and always seemed to slow down when she passed my house. Sometimes I'd catch her taking pictures of my dock or my yard, always with that serious expression on her face. About a month later, I got my first official letter from the HOA. It was delivered in a fancy envelope with Harmony Heights Homeowners Association, printed in gold letters across the top. Inside was a formal notice informing me that I needed to pay my annual HOA dues of $1,200 and that I was in violation of several community standards. The letter listed things like unauthorized dock modifications and failure to maintain approved landscaping standards. This was ridiculous because I hadn't modified anything, the dock had been there for decades, and my landscaping was professionally maintained and looked better than most of the other houses in the neighborhood. I called the HOA office and explained the situation again. The secretary, a nice woman named Betty, seemed confused and said she would have Karen call me back. When Karen called, she was no longer using her fake friendly voice. Mr. Johnson, she said, she had gotten my last name wrong, but I didn't bother correcting her. Regardless of what you think you know about your property status, you are living in our community and benefiting from our amenities. It's only fair that you contribute to the maintenance and upkeep of our neighborhood. But I'm not using your amenities, I explained. I have my own private lake access. And my property really isn't part of the HOA. I can send you copies of all the legal documents. Legal documents can be complicated, Karen said in a tone that suggested she thought I wouldn't understand them even if I tried. What matters is community harmony and everyone doing their fair share. I'm sure once you think about it, you'll see that joining our HOA is the right thing to do. I sent her the documents anyway, hoping that would put an end to it. The papers clearly showed that my property had been surveyed and excluded from the HOA boundaries when the association was formed. My deed specifically stated that my land extended to the water's edge and included riparian rights to the lake itself. But instead of apologizing or admitting she was wrong, Karen sent me another letter. This one claimed that there were discrepancies in my documentation and that the HOA would need to hire a surveyor to verify my property boundaries. She also informed me that until this matter was resolved, I would need to follow all HOA rules and regulations. This is when things started getting really ridiculous. Over the next few weeks, I received a series of violation notices for the most petty things you could imagine. My grass was apparently half an inch too long, it wasn't. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black, it was the same color it had been for 40 years. My outdoor furniture didn't meet HOA aesthetic standards, it was nice wicker furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Each violation notice came with a fine, usually between $50 and $200. When I ignored them, the fines would double. Karen seemed to be making up new rules just to target my property. She even tried to fine me for having too many visitors, because my friends came over for our regular weekend barbecues. The breaking point came when Karen sent me a certified letter claiming that my dock was a safety hazard and needed to be removed immediately. The dock that had been there for 40 years, that was built to code and regularly maintained, that was on my private property, she wanted it gone. I called a lawyer. Attorney Rebecca Martinez specialized in property law and HOA disputes. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had seen this kind of thing before. After reviewing all my documents, she confirmed what I already knew: my property was 100% not part of the HOA, and Karen had absolutely no authority over anything I did on my land. This is a clear case of HOA overreach, Rebecca told me. The woman is essentially trying to bully you into joining an organization you're not legally required to join. We need to send them a cease and desist letter immediately. The cease and desist letter was a thing of beauty. It explained in very clear legal language that my property was not part of the HOA, that all their violation notices were invalid, and that any further harassment would result in legal action. Rebecca sent copies to Karen, the HOA board, and their lawyer. For about 2 weeks, things were quiet. I thought maybe Karen had finally gotten the message and would leave me alone. I should have known better. Instead of backing down, Karen decided to escalate things in the most dramatic way possible. She started telling other neighbors that I was a troublemaker, who was bringing down property values by refusing to follow community standards. She organized a petition to try to force the city to make me join the HOA. She even called the county health department to report my dock as an environmental hazard. Every single complaint was investigated and dismissed because they were all completely baseless. But Karen kept trying. She seemed to have made it her personal mission to find some way to control what I did on my own property. The final straw came on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in June. I had invited about 15 friends over for a swimming party and barbecue. These weren't random strangers, they were people I had known for years, including several families with kids. We were having a great time, playing volleyball in the shallow water, grilling burgers, and just enjoying the perfect weather. My friend Mike had brought his twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, who were 8 years old and loved to swim. Sarah brought her teenage son Kyle, who was teaching the younger kids how to skip stones across the water. Everyone was laughing and having fun, and the kids were being perfectly well behaved. I was manning the grill, flipping hamburgers, and chatting with my buddy Dave about work, when I noticed someone marching across my yard toward the dock. At first, I thought maybe it was one of my neighbors coming to say hello or maybe ask us to keep the noise down, even though we weren't being loud. But as the figure got closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was Karen. She was wearing what looked like an official HOA polo shirt and carrying a folder full of papers. Her face was red with anger, and she was walking like she was on a military mission. The worst part was that she walked right past me, completely ignoring the fact that I was the homeowner, and headed straight for my guests who were in the water. The kids saw her coming and got nervous, probably sensing that something was wrong. Even the adults stopped what they were doing and watched her approach. And that's when Karen made the biggest mistake of her entire HOA career. Karen marched right up to the edge of my dock where my friends were enjoying themselves in the water. She didn't introduce herself or ask permission to be on my property. She just started yelling. "Excuse me. Excuse me," she shouted, waving her papers in the air like some kind of official government agent. "You people need to get out of this water immediately." My friend Sarah, who was floating peacefully on her paddleboard, nearly fell off in surprise. The kids stopped splashing and stared at this angry woman who had appeared out of nowhere. Even my dog, Buddy, started barking from where he was lying in the shade. This is a private community lake with strict usage rules. Karen continued, her voice getting louder and shriller. "You cannot just bring random people here to swim and have parties. This violates our community standards and our insurance policies." I dropped my spatula and rushed over from the grill, but Karen wasn't done with her performance yet. "I am Karen Mitchell, president of Harmony Heights HOA, and I am ordering all of you to leave this area immediately," she announced, pointing dramatically toward the street. "This kind of overcrowding and noise disruption will not be tolerated in our community." Mike's 8-year-old daughter Emma started crying because this scary lady was yelling at everyone. Kyle, Sarah's teenage son, looked confused and embarrassed, like he had done something wrong. My friend Dave just stood there in the shallow water with his mouth hanging open, probably wondering what kind of neighborhood I had moved into. That's when I stepped forward, my heart pounding with anger but trying to keep my voice calm for the sake of the kids. "Karen," I said firmly, "you need to leave my property right now. These are my invited guests, and they have every right to be here." Karen spun around to face me, and her eyes were blazing with fury. "Your guests are trespassing on HOA property," she screamed. "This lake access belongs to the community, not to you personally." "Actually," I replied, feeling that familiar surge of satisfaction, "this is my private property. The lake, the dock, the beach area, it's all mine according to my deed. You're the one who's trespassing." Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "That's impossible. Every property around this lake is part of the HOA. You can't just claim to own part of a community lake." I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I had saved of my property survey and deed. "Would you like to see the legal documents? Because I have them right here, and they clearly show that this land belongs to me, not the HOA." But Karen wasn't interested in looking at any documents. She was too worked up to listen to reason. "I don't care what fake papers you think you have," she yelled, jabbing her finger toward my chest. "I am the HOA president, and I'm telling you that this party ends right now, or I'm calling the police." The whole situation was getting out of control. My friends were uncomfortable, the kids were scared, and Karen was making a scene that the whole neighborhood could probably hear. I knew I had to end this quickly before it got even worse. That's when I said the words that would change everything. "Ma'am, you can call whoever you want, but this is my private land, and you need to get off of it immediately." Karen froze. For a moment, she just stood there staring at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. The papers in her hand stopped waving, and her mouth fell open slightly. I could literally see the gears turning in her head as she tried to process what I had just said. Your private land," she stammered, her voice suddenly much quieter. "Yes," I said calmly. "This property was never part of the HOA. It was specifically excluded when the association was formed. I own this land, the dock, and the water rights that go with it. You have no authority here whatsoever." The color started draining from Karen's face. She looked around at my friends in the water, then back at me, then at the house and dock like she was seeing them for the first time. But that's impossible," she whispered. "All the properties around the lake are HOA properties. They have to be." "I've tried to explain this to you multiple times," I said, pulling up the survey photo on my phone and holding it out for her to see. "This land predates your HOA by decades. The previous owner, Mr. Henderson, made sure I understood that when I bought the place." Karen stared at the survey document on my phone screen. Her hands were shaking now, and I could see sweat forming on her forehead despite the cool breeze coming off the lake. This can't be right," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "I've been the HOA president for 3 years. I know every property in our community. How could I not know about this?" My friend Mike, who had been comforting his crying daughter, finally spoke up. "Lady, I don't know what your deal is, but you just scared a bunch of kids and ruined our friend's party over something that's apparently none of your business. Maybe you should apologize and leave." Karen looked at Mike like she had forgotten there were other people around. She seemed to be having some kind of internal crisis, realizing that she had just made a huge mistake in front of a dozen witnesses. I need to see the actual documents," she said weakly. "The real papers, not just photos on a phone." "I'd be happy to show them to you," I replied, "but you'll need to make an appointment and come back when you can discuss this calmly and professionally. Right now, you're disrupting my guests and trespassing on my property." Karen looked around one more time at all the faces staring at her. My friends were clearly annoyed, the kids were still upset, and everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. She seemed to realize that she had put herself in an impossible position. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice had lost all its authority. She sounded more confused than threatening now. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this." "That's fine," I said. "But for now, you need to leave." Karen clutched her papers to her chest and started walking back toward the street, but she kept turning around to look at the property like she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. It was clear that her whole understanding of the neighborhood had just been turned upside down. After she left, there was an awkward silence for a few minutes. My friends didn't quite know what to say, and the kids were still a little shaken up from having some angry stranger yell at them. "Well," Sarah finally said, breaking the tension, "that was interesting." "I'm really sorry, everyone," I said, feeling genuinely bad that my guests had to deal with Karen's craziness. "That woman has been harassing me ever since I moved in, but I never thought she'd actually confront people at a private party." "Don't apologize," Dave said, wading back into the water. "That lady was completely out of line. You handled it perfectly." Emma, Mike's daughter, had stopped crying and was looking up at me with big, curious eyes. "Mr. Jake," she said in her sweet 8-year-old voice, "why was that lady so mean? We weren't doing anything wrong." "You're absolutely right, sweetie," I told her. "You weren't doing anything wrong at all. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and get confused about things. The important thing is that you're safe and we can keep having fun." Gradually, everyone relaxed and went back to enjoying the party. The kids resumed their swimming and stone-skipping contests, the adults continued their conversations, and I got back to grilling the burgers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation with Karen was just the beginning of something much bigger. Over the next few days, I noticed some changes in the neighborhood. Karen had apparently told other HOA members about our encounter, and word was spreading quickly. Some neighbors seemed sympathetic to my situation, they had probably dealt with Karen's overzealous rule enforcement themselves. But others seemed suspicious, like maybe I was trying to get away with something I shouldn't be doing. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor with the homemade cookies, stopped by on Tuesday evening to check on me. "I heard there was some kind of commotion at your party over the weekend," she said, settling into one of my porch chairs with a concerned expression. "Karen's been telling everyone that you're claiming to own part of the lake." "It's not a claim," I explained gently. "I do own this part of the lake. I have all the legal documentation to prove it." Mrs. Patterson looked surprised. "Really? I've lived here for 12 years, and I always assumed all the lakefront property belonged to the HOA. I went inside and got my folder of property documents, the ones I had offered to show Karen multiple times." Mrs. Patterson put on her reading glasses and carefully examined the deed, the survey, and the title insurance policy. "Oh my goodness," she said after a few minutes. "You're absolutely right. This is all very official and clear. Your property goes right out into the lake." She looked up at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Jake, do you realize what this means? Karen has been trying to enforce HOA rules on property that isn't even part of the HOA. She could get the association in serious legal trouble." I hadn't really thought about it from that angle, but Mrs. Patterson was right. By sending me violation notices, demanding fines, and trying to regulate my property, Karen had been acting outside her authority in a way that could expose the HOA to lawsuits. "I never wanted to cause problems for anyone," I said. "I just want to enjoy my property in peace." "Of course you do, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, patting my hand. "But I'm afraid Karen isn't going to let this go easily. She's very proud of being HOA president, and admitting she made such a big mistake would be, well, it would be very hard for her." Mrs. Patterson was absolutely right. Over the next week, instead of apologizing or backing down, Karen seemed to double down on her position. She started spreading rumors around the neighborhood that I was using fake documents to try to avoid paying HOA fees. She told people that I was freeloading off community amenities while refusing to contribute to their maintenance. The most ridiculous part was that I wasn't using any community amenities. The HOA had their own small beach area and dock on the other side of the lake, but I had never set foot on it. I had my own private access that was much nicer and more convenient. I wasn't costing the HOA a single penny. But Karen's rumors started having an effect. Some neighbors began giving me cold looks when I was out checking my mail or working in my yard. A few people who had been friendly before started avoiding eye contact. It was clear that Karen was trying to turn the community against me. The situation got worse when Karen organized what she called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the property dispute involving my house. She sent notices to every HOA member claiming that there was a legal challenge to community property rights that could affect everyone's property values. I wasn't invited to this meeting, of course, since I wasn't an HOA member. But Mrs. Patterson attended and filled me in on what happened. It was quite a scene, she told me the next day, shaking her head. Karen had prepared this whole presentation with maps and charts, trying to convince everyone that your property really belongs to the HOA. She claimed that the previous owner must have forged documents or that there was some kind of clerical error when the association was formed. What did the other members say? I asked. Well, most people seemed confused. A few asked to see your actual documents, but Karen said that wouldn't be necessary because she was handling the legal aspects of the situation. Tom and Linda from across the street asked some good questions about property surveys and title insurance, but Karen got very defensive and said they should trust her expertise as HOA president. Mrs. Patterson paused and looked at me seriously. Jake, I think she's planning something. At the end of the meeting, she announced that the HOA was going to hire a lawyer to investigate your property claims and protect community interests. She seemed very confident that they would prove you wrong. This was getting completely out of hand. I called my lawyer, Rebecca Martinez, and explained what was happening. They're going to waste a lot of money on legal fees just to have a lawyer tell them exactly what I already told them, Rebecca said with a laugh. Your ownership is ironclad. There's no dispute here from a legal standpoint. But what if they try to sue me or something? I asked. Let them try, Rebecca replied confidently. If they want to file a frivolous lawsuit, we'll countersue for harassment and legal fees. Any competent attorney who reviews your documents will advise them to drop this immediately. But Karen wasn't interested in competent legal advice. She was determined to prove that she was right and I was wrong, regardless of what the law actually said. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from something called Peterson, Williams and Associates, attorneys at law. The letter was written in intimidating legal language and demanded that I provide all documentation related to your alleged ownership claims within 30 days. The letter also informed me that the HOA was investigating potential fraud and forgery related to my property documents and that I should cease all use of disputed community amenities immediately or face appropriate legal action. I forwarded the letter to Rebecca, who called me back within an hour, and she was laughing so hard she could barely speak. Jake, she said between giggles, this is the most ridiculous legal threat I've seen in 20 years of practice. They're essentially threatening to sue you for owning your own property. I'm going to have so much fun responding to this. Rebecca's response letter was a masterpiece. She attached copies of all my property documents and explained in excruciating legal detail exactly why my ownership was valid and unquestionable. She also pointed out that the HOA's threats constituted harassment and that continued interference with my property rights could result in significant legal consequences for them. But the best part was her closing paragraph, which essentially told them that if they wanted to waste money on a lawsuit they were guaranteed to lose, she would be happy to take their money in court. I thought that would be the end of it. Surely, once their lawyer explained the situation to them, even Karen would have to admit defeat and leave me alone. But I had seriously underestimated just how stubborn and delusional Karen Mitchell could be when her authority was challenged. Instead of backing down, she decided to take the nuclear option. 3 days after Rebecca sent her response, I woke up to find 2 county sheriff's deputies standing on my front porch, along with Karen and a man I didn't recognize who was carrying what looked like surveying equipment. Are you Jake Morrison? One of the deputies asked when I opened the door. Yes, that's me, I replied, completely confused about what was happening. We have a court order here requiring you to allow these folks access to your property for an official survey, the deputy said, handing me a legal document. There's been a dispute filed about property boundaries, and the court has ordered an independent survey to resolve the matter. I looked at the court order, then at Karen, who was standing behind the deputies with a smug expression on her face like she had just won the lottery. That's when I realized that Karen had somehow managed to convince a judge that there was a legitimate property dispute that required court intervention. She had taken our HOA conflict and turned it into an official legal battle, complete with sheriff's deputies and court-ordered surveys. As I stood there reading the court order, Karen stepped forward with that fake smile of hers and said in a loud voice, "Don't worry, Jake. Once this official survey proves that your documents are fraudulent, we can resolve this whole misunderstanding and get you properly enrolled in the HOA where you belong." The surveyor, who had been quietly setting up his equipment, suddenly stopped and looked up at Karen with a puzzled expression. "Ma'am," he said, "I've already reviewed the existing survey and deed information for this property. The ownership boundaries are quite clear and well documented. I'm not sure why the court ordered this resurvey." Karen's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Well, I'm sure there are discrepancies that need to be investigated. That's why we're here. What happened next would change everything, not just for me and Karen, but for the entire Harmony Heights community. Because what that surveyor discovered during his court-ordered investigation would expose a secret that Karen had been desperately trying to hide, and it would turn her from the person making accusations into the person who had some very serious explaining to do." The surveyor, whose name was Bill Thompson, spent about 20 minutes setting up his equipment and taking measurements around my property. Karen stood nearby the whole time, tapping her foot impatiently and checking her watch like she had somewhere important to be. The sheriff's deputies had left after making sure everyone understood the court order, but they said they'd be back later to get a copy of the survey results. "This shouldn't take too long," Bill told me as he adjusted his surveying instrument. "Your property lines are actually very well marked and documented. Whoever did the original survey back in the 1980s did excellent work." Karen perked up when she heard this. "So you'll be able to prove that the property boundaries are different from what his fake documents claim?" she asked hopefully. Bill looked at her with confusion. "Ma'am, I'm not here to prove anything one way or another. I'm just here to measure the actual property boundaries and compare them to the existing records. But I have to tell you, the documents I reviewed before coming out here all look perfectly legitimate and properly recorded." "Well, we'll see about that," Karen said with a sniff. "I've been the HOA president for 3 years, and I know every single property in this community. This land has always been part of our association." Bill stopped what he was doing and looked at Karen more carefully. "Can I ask you something? How long has your HOA been in existence?" 15 years, Karen replied proudly. "We were formed in 2010 to protect property values and maintain community standards around Lake Harmony." Bill nodded thoughtfully. "And this property we're surveying, do you know when it was first developed?" "Well, I assume it was built around the same time as the other houses," Karen said, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Actually," I interjected, "my house was built in 1962. The previous owner, Mr. Henderson, lived here for over 40 years before I bought it." Bill's eyebrows went up. 1962. So this property existed for almost 50 years before the HOA was even formed? "That's correct," I said. "Mr. Henderson told me that when the developer created the HOA in 2010, they specifically excluded his property because it already existed and had its own lake access." Karen was starting to look uncomfortable. That doesn't sound right. Why would they exclude lakefront property from a lakefront community association?" "Because," Bill said slowly, "you can't force existing property owners to join an HOA without their consent. If this gentleman's property was already here with established lake rights, the HOA would have had to form around it, not through it." I watched Karen's face as the implications of what Bill was saying started to sink in. She had spent months harassing me based on the assumption that my property was part of her HOA, but she had never actually checked to see when my house was built or whether it had been included in the original HOA formation. "But surely," Karen said, grasping for some way to salvage her position, "even if the property predates the HOA, it would still need to follow community standards for the good of everyone's property values." Bill shook his head. "That's not how property law works. If a property isn't part of an HOA, then the HOA has no authority over it whatsoever. They can't enforce their rules, collect dues, or regulate anything the property owner does, assuming they're following city and county ordinances, of course. Karen was getting more agitated by the minute. This is ridiculous. You can't just have one property in the middle of a community that doesn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Actually, Bill said with a slight smile, you can. It happens all the time when HOAs are formed around existing properties. The existing owners have what we call the grandfathered rights that protect them from being forced into associations they never agreed to join. While Bill continued taking his measurements, I could see Karen pacing back and forth, clearly trying to figure out how to spin this situation in her favor. She kept muttering things under her breath like, "This can't be right," and "There has to be some mistake." After about an hour, Bill finished his survey and started packing up his equipment. "Well," he announced, "the results are exactly what I expected. The property boundaries match the existing deed and survey documents perfectly. Everything checks out." Karen rushed over to him. "What do you mean everything checks out? Aren't there any discrepancies? Any errors in the documentation?" "None whatsoever," Bill replied matter-of-factly. "This is one of the cleanest property surveys I've seen. The boundaries are clear, the lake access rights are properly documented, and all the legal descriptions match perfectly." "But what about the HOA boundaries?" Karen asked desperately. "Surely this property should be included in the HOA boundaries." Bill pulled out a folder and showed Karen a map. "Here's the thing that's interesting," he said. "I looked up the original HOA formation documents from 2010, and this property is very specifically excluded from the association boundaries. It's not an oversight or a mistake, it was intentionally left out." Karen stared at the map like it was written in a foreign language. That can't be right. Why would they do that?" "Because," Bill explained patiently, "the property already existed with its own lake access and rights. The developer who formed the HOA would have needed Mr. Henderson's permission to include his property, and apparently, he chose not to join. I remembered what Mr. Henderson had told me when I bought the house. He had mentioned that some developer had tried to get him to join their new HOA, but he had declined because he didn't want to pay fees for amenities he didn't need and didn't want other people controlling what he could do on his own land. So what you're saying," I said to Bill, "is that my property has never been part of the HOA, was never supposed to be part of the HOA, and legally cannot be forced to become part of the HOA?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Bill confirmed. "You own your land outright, including the lake access, and the HOA has no legal authority over your property whatsoever." Karen looked like someone had just told her that gravity was optional. Her whole worldview was crashing down around her, and she didn't know how to process it. "But I've been sending him violation notices," she said weakly. "I've been trying to collect HOA dues from him. I told him his dock was a safety hazard that needed to be removed." Bill looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "Ma'am, if this gentleman isn't part of your HOA, then you have no authority to send him violation notices or collect dues from him. And you definitely can't make him remove a dock that's on his own private property." The reality of the situation was finally hitting Karen full force. She had spent months harassing me, threatening me, and trying to control my property based on completely false assumptions. She had organized emergency HOA meetings, hired lawyers, and even gotten the court involved in a dispute that shouldn't have existed in the first place. "This is a disaster," Karen mumbled, more to herself than to anyone else. "How did I not know about this? How could I make such a huge mistake?" "To be fair," Bill said gently, "it's not uncommon for people to assume that all properties in a neighborhood are part of the same HOA. But as an HOA president, you really should have checked the association boundaries and membership records before taking any enforcement actions." Karen's face went through several different shades of red as the full implications of her mistakes became clear. She had not only wasted months of her own time, but she had also gotten the entire HOA involved in a legal dispute that was going to cost them money and make them look foolish. "What am I going to tell the other HOA members?" she asked, looking genuinely panicked now. "We hired a lawyer. We filed court papers. Everyone thinks this guy is trying to cheat the system. You're going to have to tell them the truth, Bill said simply. That you made an error in judgment and that this property was never part of the HOA to begin with. I almost felt sorry for Karen at that moment. Almost. She looked so defeated and confused that it was hard to stay angry at her. But then I remembered all the stress she had put me through, all the threatening letters, all the times she had tried to embarrass me in front of my friends and neighbors. Karen, I said as calmly as I could manage, I tried to explain this to you multiple times. I offered to show you my documents. I had my lawyer send you official letters. You could have avoided all of this if you had just listened. Karen looked at me with tears starting to form in her eyes. I thought you were just trying to get out of paying your fair share. I thought you were taking advantage of the community. I understand that you were trying to do what you thought was right for the HOA, I said. But you went about it in the wrong way. You harassed me, you scared my guests, and you spread rumors about me to the neighbors. That wasn't okay. Bill finished packing his equipment and handed us each a copy of his survey report. Well, folks, my job here is done. The court will receive my official report within 48 hours, and that should put an end to this whole dispute. After Bill left, Karen and I stood there in awkward silence for a few minutes. She kept looking at the survey report like she was hoping the words would magically change if she stared at them long enough. Jake, she finally said, I owe you an apology. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm sorry for all the trouble I've caused you. I appreciated the apology, but I could tell there was something else bothering her. What's wrong, Karen? You look like there's something else you're worried about. Karen bit her lip and looked around nervously, like she was afraid someone might overhear us. It's just, this whole situation is going to make me look really bad to the other HOA members. I've been president for 3 years, and I pride myself on knowing everything about our community. If word gets out that I spent months harassing someone who wasn't even supposed to be in our HOA, your reputation is going to suffer, I finished for her. Exactly, Karen said miserably. Some people have already been questioning my leadership style. They think I'm too aggressive with rule enforcement. When they find out about this mistake, they might try to remove me as president. I could see that Karen was genuinely upset about the possibility of losing her position. Being HOA president was clearly very important to her identity and self-worth. But I also knew that she had brought this situation on herself through her own stubborn refusal to listen to reason. Maybe this could be a learning experience, I suggested. You could use it as an opportunity to change your approach and be more collaborative with residents instead of so confrontational. Karen nodded sadly. You're probably right. But I'm not sure the other members will give me that chance. Tom and Linda have been wanting to run for president for years, and this could be just the excuse they need to challenge me. Over the next few days, word of the survey results spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some people were embarrassed that they had believed Karen's rumors about me. Others were angry that the HOA had wasted money on legal fees for a dispute that should never have happened. A few neighbors even stopped by to apologize for treating me coldly after Karen's smear campaign. Mrs. Patterson brought me another batch of cookies and an update on the neighborhood gossip. There's going to be another emergency HOA meeting next week, she told me. People are demanding answers about how this whole mess happened and why nobody checked the property records before filing court papers. How is Karen handling all of this? I asked. Not well, Mrs. Patterson replied with a shake of her head. She's been going door to door trying to explain herself, but she's just making things worse. Yesterday she tried to blame the HOA's lawyer for not catching the mistake, but everyone knows she was the one pushing for legal action. I felt a mix of relief and sympathy. Relief that this nightmare was finally over and that everyone now knew I had been telling the truth all along. But also sympathy for Karen, who was clearly struggling with the consequences of her actions. But my sympathy was about to be tested in a way I never could have imagined. Because what happened at that emergency HOA meeting would reveal that Karen's mistakes were even bigger and more shocking than anyone had realized. And when the truth finally came out about what she had been hiding from the community, it would change everything about how the neighbors saw both her and the HOA itself. The revelations that were about to come to light would make our property dispute look like a minor disagreement compared to the bombshell that was about to explode in Harmony Heights. And Karen Mitchell was about to learn that sometimes, when you dig a hole for someone else, you end up falling into it yourself. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, and Mrs. Patterson convinced me that I should attend even though I wasn't technically an HOA member. "People need to hear your side of the story," she said. "And honestly, I think there are going to be some very difficult questions for Karen to answer." When I arrived at the meeting, the community center was packed. I had never seen so many neighbors in one place before. There were familiar faces from around the neighborhood, but also people I didn't recognize who must have lived in the parts of the development I rarely visited. The energy in the room was tense, like everyone was waiting for something dramatic to happen. Karen was sitting at the front table with the other HOA board members, and she looked absolutely miserable. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and nervous fidgeting. She kept shuffling through a stack of papers and avoiding eye contact with the audience. Tom and Linda, the couple from across the street who Mrs. Patterson had mentioned might challenge Karen's leadership, were sitting in the front row with stern expressions on their faces. Tom had a folder full of documents, and Linda was taking notes on a legal pad like she was preparing for a court case. The meeting started with Karen attempting to give her version of what had happened with my property dispute. She tried to frame it as an honest mistake that could have happened to anyone, but her explanation was rambling and defensive. She kept saying things like, "I was just trying to protect community interests," and anyone would have made the same assumptions. But when she opened the floor for questions, things got very uncomfortable very quickly. Tom stood up first. "Karen, I've been reviewing the HOA's financial records, and I have some serious concerns about how this situation was handled. Can you explain why you authorized spending over $5,000 on legal fees without getting board approval first?" Karen's face turned red. I thought I had the authority to handle legal matters as president. I was trying to protect the HOA's interests. But the bylaws clearly state that any expenditure over $2,500 requires a board vote, Linda added, standing up next to her husband. "You violated our own governing documents." A murmur went through the crowd. This was apparently news to many of the HOA members, and they didn't look happy about it. Furthermore, Tom continued, "I've been looking into the original HOA formation documents, and I found some very interesting information. Karen, did you know that when you sent violation notices to Mr. Morrison here, you were actually committing a form of legal harassment?" Karen looked panicked. "I was just enforcing community standards. I didn't know his property wasn't part of the HOA." "But that's exactly the problem," said a woman I didn't recognize from the back of the room. "As HOA president, it was your responsibility to know which properties are actually part of the association. You can't just assume." Another resident raised his hand. "I want to know why Karen was so determined to go after this one property. I've lived here for 8 years, and I've seen plenty of rule violations that she ignored completely. Why was she so focused on Mr. Morrison's house?" This was a question I hadn't expected, and I could see Karen squirming uncomfortably in her chair. She clearly didn't want to answer it. I was trying to be thorough," she stammered. "I noticed some issues with the property maintenance and wanted to address them." "What issues?" Tom asked pointedly. "I drive by Mr. Morrison's house every day, and it's one of the nicest looking properties in the neighborhood." Karen opened and closed her mouth several times, but no words came out. It was becoming obvious to everyone in the room that her harassment of me had been personal rather than professional. That's when Linda dropped the bombshell that changed everything. "I think there's something else everyone needs to know," Linda announced, standing up and opening her folder. "Tom and I have been doing some research into Karen's tenure as HOA president, and we've discovered some very disturbing patterns of behavior." Karen went completely white. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you've been using your position as HOA president to target people you personally don't like," Linda said, her voice getting stronger and more confident. "Mr. Morrison isn't the first person you've harassed with bogus violation notices." Linda pulled out a sheet of paper and began reading from it. In the past 2 years, you've issued violation notices to the Johnson family for excessive holiday decorations that were actually quite modest. You fined the Rodriguez family $500 for having too many cars in their driveway, when they had exactly the same number of cars as half the other families in the neighborhood. You tried to force Mrs. Chen to remove her vegetable garden because it didn't meet aesthetic standards, even though there's nothing in the HOA rules about vegetable gardens. The room was completely silent as Linda continued her list. I looked around and could see neighbors nodding in recognition. Apparently, many people had experienced Karen's selective enforcement of rules. But here's the most shocking part, Linda continued. I spoke with Mrs. Chen yesterday, and she told me something very interesting. Karen apparently told her that if she joined Karen's book club and became more involved in community activities, maybe the violation notices would stop coming. A collective gasp went up from the audience. This was way beyond overzealous rule enforcement. This was Karen using her HOA position to coerce people into doing what she wanted. That's not true. Karen shouted, jumping up from her chair. Mrs. Chen is lying. I never said anything like that. But Mrs. Chen herself was at the meeting, and she stood up from her seat in the middle of the room. She was a quiet, elderly woman who rarely spoke at community events, but now she looked determined to be heard. Karen Mitchell, Mrs. Chen said in accented but clear English, you came to my house 3 times. You told me my garden was bringing down property values and that I needed to fit in better with the community. You said if I joined your book club and your gardening committee, you would work with me on the violations. The room erupted in angry murmurs. People were turning to each other, sharing stories of their own encounters with Karen's arbitrary rule enforcement. It was becoming clear that Karen had been running the HOA like her own personal kingdom, using her authority to reward friends and punish people she didn't like. Tom stood up again, his voice stern and authoritative. Karen, this is completely unacceptable behavior for an HOA president. You've violated your oath of office, you've harassed residents, and you've exposed the association to potential lawsuits. I was just trying to maintain community standards. Karen protested, but her voice was weak and desperate now. No, said a man I recognized from a few streets over, you were trying to control people. There's a big difference. That's when the most devastating revelation of all came to light. Linda wasn't done with her research findings. There's one more thing, Linda announced, and the room fell silent again. I also discovered that Karen has been lying about her qualifications to be HOA president. Karen looked like she was about to faint. What do you mean? I mean, Linda said, pulling out another document, that you've been telling everyone you have a degree in business management and experience in community association management. But I did some checking, and that's not true, is it, Karen? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She clearly had no idea how to respond to this accusation. Karen Mitchell, Linda continued, never graduated from college. She worked as a part-time receptionist at a dental office before she got married and became a stay-at-home mom. She has no formal training in business, management, or HOA governance whatsoever. The room exploded in angry voices. People were shouting questions and demands for Karen to explain herself. Some residents were calling for her immediate resignation. Others were talking about legal action against her for fraud. I sat there in shock, watching Karen's entire world collapse around her. In the span of 1 week, she had gone from being the powerful HOA president who thought she could control my property to being exposed as a liar and a bully who had been abusing her authority for years. This meeting is over. Karen suddenly shouted, grabbing her papers and rushing toward the door. I don't have to listen to these accusations. But Tom's voice boomed across the room, stopping her in her tracks. Actually, Karen, you do. As an elected official of this HOA, you have a responsibility to answer to the residents you serve. And right now, we're calling for a vote of no confidence. The formal vote was swift and decisive. Out of 47 HOA members present, 44 voted to remove Karen as president immediately. Only 3 people abstained, nobody voted to keep her in office. Karen stood frozen at the back of the room as the results were announced. When she realized that her reign as HOA president was officially over, she looked around the room one more time with tears streaming down her face, then ran out the door without saying another word. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood went through a period of healing and rebuilding. Tom was elected as the new HOA president, and one of his first official acts was to send me a formal letter of apology on behalf of the association. The letter acknowledged that I had been wrongfully harassed and that the HOA would pay for all my legal fees related to the dispute. But more importantly, Tom implemented new policies to prevent future abuse of authority. All violation notices now had to be approved by at least 2 board members. All legal expenses over $1,000 required a full board vote. And all HOA presidents were required to complete training in community association law and ethics. Karen never attended another community event. She put her house on the market within a month of being removed from office and moved away without saying goodbye to any of her neighbors. Mrs. Patterson heard through the real estate grapevine that Karen and her family relocated to a different state, presumably to start fresh somewhere that didn't know about her HOA scandal. As for me, I was finally able to enjoy my beautiful lakefront property in peace. My weekend barbecues resumed without any unwelcome interruptions from angry HOA presidents. My friends felt comfortable visiting again, and the kids could swim and play without worrying about some adult yelling at them for no reason. The most satisfying part, though, was watching the neighborhood transform under Tom's leadership. Instead of fear-based rule enforcement, the new HOA focused on community building and collaborative problem solving. Violation notices became rare, and when issues did arise, they were handled with respect and common sense rather than threats and intimidation. Mrs. Chen was able to keep her vegetable garden, and she even started sharing her homegrown tomatoes with neighbors. The Rodriguez family no longer worried about parking their cars in their own driveway. The Johnson family put up even more holiday decorations the next year, and everyone agreed they made the neighborhood more festive and welcoming. One evening, about 6 months after Karen's downfall, I was sitting on my dock watching the sunset when Mrs. Patterson walked over to join me. "You know," she said, settling into one of my dock chairs, "I think Karen actually did this neighborhood a favor in the end." "How do you figure that?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Well," Mrs. Patterson replied with a smile, "her behavior was so outrageous that it forced everyone to pay attention to how the HOA was being run. If she had been just a little bit smarter about her power trips, she might have gotten away with it for years. But by going after you so aggressively over something so obviously wrong, she exposed herself completely." Mrs. Patterson was absolutely right. Karen's obsession with controlling my property had been her ultimate undoing. If she had been content to abuse her authority in smaller, less noticeable ways, she might have remained HOA president indefinitely. But her determination to prove she was right about my property, even when all the evidence showed she was wrong, had led to her complete exposure and downfall. "I guess there's a lesson in all of this," I said, watching a family of ducks paddle peacefully across the lake. "When you spend all your time trying to control other people instead of focusing on doing the right thing, eventually it catches up with you." "Exactly," Mrs. Patterson agreed. And the beautiful irony is that Karen lost everything because she refused to admit she was wrong about something that was actually very simple. All she had to do was look at your property records and apologize for the mistake. Instead, she doubled down and kept digging until she buried herself completely. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that first day when Karen had marched across my yard and demanded that my guests leave her lake. What had started as a simple property dispute had revealed the truth about power, corruption, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Karen Mitchell had thought she could intimidate me into submission by using her authority as HOA president. She had assumed that her position gave her the right to control my property and my life. But in the end, the truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and our community had become stronger and more united than ever before. And every time I watched the sunrise from my private dock, I was reminded that sometimes the biggest bullies fall the hardest when their victims refuse to back down and the community finally sees them for who they really are. The lake was peaceful again, the neighborhood was thriving under honest leadership, and I was free to enjoy my property exactly as I had always dreamed. Karen's reign of terror was over, and Harmony Heights had truly become the harmonious community it was always meant to be. If this incredible story of justice, community, and standing up to bullies has inspired you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with anyone who's ever dealt with an overpowering HOA or neighborhood bully. Sometimes the good guys really do win in the end.